This is the Las Vegas of Asia, better known as Macau, a special administrative district that's both part of and not part of China. And this is the Venetian Macau, a behemoth of a building that's home to the largest casino in the world, with over 51,000 square meters of gambling space, 3,400 slot machines, and 800 gambling tables. It's also the largest single-structure hotel in all of Asia. The Venetian Macau is one of 30 casinos squished into a district only a little over 12 square miles in area. You see, this tiny peninsula off the southern coast of China manages more wagers than every casino in Las Vegas combined. Its brightly lit casinos have drawn comparisons to Sin City. So how did Macau rise to global dominance? What challenges does it face now? And more importantly, what does the future hold for the Las Vegas of Asia? Originally, Macau was nothing more than a modest fishing village, a quiet port that offered shelter to Chinese merchants and fishermen, and not much else. But when Portuguese traders set foot here in the 16th century, everything changed. Their first encounters with the Ming dynasty weren't exactly diplomatic. Initial attempts at establishing trade posts turned violent, and the Portuguese were dealt defeat after defeat along the Pearl River. But the Portuguese had come with a plan, and they weren't about to abandon it. In 1554, they returned to the negotiating table, this time securing a lease for Macau. For hundreds of silver taels a year, Portugal had what it wanted, a foothold on Chinese soil. The small fishing port was quickly transformed as Portuguese built homes, churches, and even a municipal council by 1583 to oversee their growing settlement. Now, Macau had become an indispensable link on the sea route, connecting Japan to Europe. It was the warehouse of the Far East. And then came the gambling. Macau's reputation as Asia's gambling capital has roots that stretch back nearly 2 centuries, built upon a legacy of colonial strategy and economic pragmatism. When the Portuguese legalized gambling in 1847, it was less a revolutionary vision and more of an attempt to formalize what was already a deeply embedded practice. Macau had been a place of trade, a melting pot where East met West, and this diversity brought with it a taste for games of chance. You had Fan Tan, the most popular, which involved a dealer placing a pile of small objects like buttons or coins on a table, covering them up, and then removing them in groups of 4 until only 1, 2, 3, or 4 objects were left. Players would place bets on how many would remain. There was this one, Pai Gao, which was a bit like a fusion of dominoes and blackjack. There was even a lottery, but all this had been quite informal. Now the government was in on the action, ready to transform the colony's economy around it. They granted licenses to a small number of gambling houses, each paying a fee that would go directly into the administration's treasury. And just like that, Macau's economy began a sharp turn, pivoting from its early days as a fishing village to a new identity as a regional gambling hub. What had once been the activity of the few now drew visitors from across Asia, each one eager to try their luck in this new legal oasis of betting. Fast forward to the 1960s, and Macau's gambling industry was about to get supercharged. In 1962, the government granted a monopoly to a company called Sociedade de Turismo e Diversões de Macau, or STDM for short. The company was owned and operated by this guy, Stanley Ho. Known as the gambling king of Macau, Ho famously never gambled himself, but he transformed Macau's seedy, windowless gambling dens into glitzy casinos that attracted wealthy high rollers from all over Asia. His first project was the Estoril Hotel, which became Macau's first luxury hotel and casino in 1962. In 1970, he built the Casino Lisboa, a modest 12-story building that would eventually transform into the massive Grand Lisboa. At his height, Ho owned over 20 casinos. He even opened one up in North Korea. But Ho's real genius was figuring out how to turn gambling into a VIP service. He invested in high-speed ferries that could transport wealthy gamblers to Macau from Hong Kong. He built an entire harbor to make this happen, and in the 90s he built another one. This is the Outer Harbor Ferry Terminal. Then, in 1999, he bought the company Turbojet, which makes high-speed ferries, and amassed one of the world's largest fleets of them. The VIPs were flooding in. But the legitimization of gambling in Macau came with, let's say, some complications. With money flowing in, it attracted powerful syndicates, groups with names like 14K and the Sun Yeon triads, that saw an opening in the lack of strict oversight. These groups started taking control of gambling operations, creating a shadow network that operated behind the scenes. Stanley Ho was rumored to have been quite cozy with many of them, though he's never been directly incriminated in anything. Ho helped create what became known as junket operators. Basically, he gave different triads, which are basically Chinese crime syndicates, the privilege of managing different gambling rooms in his various casinos, allegedly at least. You see, they were like the middlemen who organized trips for wealthy clients, gave them lines of credit, and managed debts, oftentimes collecting these debts in not-so-savory ways. For the triads, Macau's relaxed regulatory environment made it a safe haven for high-stakes gambling and high profits. But uncertainty about the future of the peninsula had been simmering behind the scenes for decades. In 1974, Portugal experienced a coup known as the Carnation Revolution. With the previously authoritarian government ousted, Portugal started withdrawing from its overseas colonial territories. Macau was one of them. In 1978, Portugal offered to return Macau to China, but Beijing refused because it was dealing with ongoing negotiations with the British over Hong Kong and feared that if they moved too fast on Macau, the British would raise their eyebrows and see China as hungry for too much territory. But in 1987, they finally drew up this treaty, the Joint Declaration on the Question of Macau. In it, China and Portugal agreed that Macau would become part of Chinese territory and that the government of the People's Republic of China will resume the exercise of sovereignty over Macau with the effect from 20 December 1999. It also declared that Macau would be run under the principle of one country, two systems. The peninsula became what's known as a special administrative region, similar to Hong Kong. The treaty then lays out 12 policies that define how this one country, two systems system would work. China would have sovereignty over Macau and control external relations and defense, but the current social and economic systems in Macau would remain unchanged, and the rights and freedoms of the inhabitants would be protected. Portuguese was kept as an official language, and this is very pertinent to the whole casino industry, Macau was able to maintain and develop economic and cultural relations and conclude agreements with interested countries, regions, and international organizations, as well as maintain a free port and a separate customs territory for the purposes of its economic activities, and that the free flow of capital will be maintained. The 12th point concludes by stating that these policies will remain unchanged for 50 years, until 2049. Change can be messy though, and in 1987, news of the impending handover had many people worried, particularly casino owners like Stanley Ho and the organized crime groups that were profiting off the loose regulations that had been in place for so many decades prior. In the 90s, things came to a head in what's become known as the Casino Wars, as the triads, sensing that things could change and not change for the better, started asserting themselves more. As rival triads jostled for control over the junket operations, their methods became increasingly violent, with targeted attacks aimed at intimidating opponents and tightening their grip on the industry. There were public shootings and even attacks on government officials. At one point, the Wall Street Journal called Macau's urban core the most lawless 6 square miles on Earth. In December 1999, Macau was officially handed over to China and the casino wars had fizzled out. But the question of who really held the power in Macau remained, setting the stage for a new era under Chinese rule, one where the stakes would only grow higher. So what happened? How did Macau go from being described as the most lawless 6 square miles on Earth to one of the most powerful economies? The answer, it seems, lies in American casino companies. When Macau was finally handed over to China in 1999, the city's future was a question mark. The casino wars of the 90s had left scars on its streets, and triads still wielded a lot of influence behind the scenes. For Beijing, the return of Macau was a test case, a chance to transform the city into an economic powerhouse through an unexpected path: foreign casino giants. American casino giants, to be precise. But could American corporations really reshape Macau's fortunes? The answer came quickly. In 2002, Macau's government did the unthinkable. It broke Stanley Ho's 40-year monopoly on gambling. Macau opened the doors to foreign players, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. Las Vegas Sands, led by billionaire casino magnate Sheldon Adelson, became one of the first to jump in. And in 2004, Adelson unveiled this, the Sands Macau, a sprawling, glittering casino designed to pull people in and keep them coming back for more. Within 10 months, the Sands had recouped its entire $240 million investment, setting off an economic boom that would remake Macau. What the Sands introduced was more than just a new casino. It was a new kind of gaming experience. Instead of the dark, smoky gambling halls Stanley Ho had made a killing off of, Macau now had bright, open spaces, modeled after the grand floors of Las Vegas. Visitors arrived in droves from mainland China, where gambling was illegal but culturally entrenched. Macau's new casinos catered to this demand, transforming the city from a backwater into a glitzy capital of chance. And the results were astounding. In 2006, Macau's gaming revenue had raked in nearly $7 billion, bettering Vegas's take by $500 million, becoming the world's most profitable gaming hub. And in welcoming 24 million visitors that year, Macau became as popular as Hong Kong for the first time, in at least 150 years. For Beijing, the transformation of Macau was a strategic success. It provided a tightly controlled outlet for Chinese spending, just a ferry ride away from Hong Kong and the mainland. The new Macau was attracting millions. By 2018, over 35 million tourists visited the territory, with the vast majority coming from mainland China. What had once been a risky experiment was now an economic engine. But this prosperity came with strings attached. US casino giants found themselves in an unusual position, dependent on the Chinese government's tolerance and policy whims. Anti-corruption crackdowns periodically struck high-stakes gambling in Macau, as officials tried to control capital flight and money laundering. The territory's reliance on gambling revenue left it vulnerable to the same forces that fueled its rise. For Macau, this new era of prosperity came with a question. Could the city's economy really sustain itself on gambling alone, or was it building on a fragile foundation? With each new luxury resort, Macau became more entrenched in a complex relationship with Beijing, where the flow of visitors and revenue could shift with a single government directive. As Macau cemented its place as the Las Vegas of Asia, it also raised a deeper question, one with implications not just for the city but for all of China. What happens when an economic experiment thrives but remains tethered to the political decisions of a one-party state? Well, let's break it down, shall we? The designation of Macau as a special administrative region has allowed China to dabble in capitalism while remaining socialist and/or authoritarian. Macau serves as a kind of testing ground for policies that could later be applied to mainland cities. Beijing can experiment with regulatory practices and economic models in Macau, refining them before implementing them on a larger scale. It led to something many experts call casino capitalism. Basically, Macau's casinos serve a dual purpose. They're sites of entertainment and profit, yes, but they're also tools for crafting a new post-socialist Chinese identity. Beijing allows Macau to operate outside the mainland's strict regulatory boundaries, leveraging it to model and promote consumer citizens within China's controlled market economy. There's also something called the Individual Visitation Scheme, which was introduced in 2003 and encourages mainland citizens to visit Macau independently, generating a surge in tourism and revenue while nurturing a consumer culture that aligns with China's evolving economic ambitions. It's a pretty brilliant strategy. It allows for limited capitalist practices within tightly controlled zones, and basically uses Macau's sovereignty as a buffer. The casinos, which were once symbols of Macau's colonial past and triad influence, have shifted to represent a state-engineered version of capitalism that aligns local profit motives with China's broader, centralized economic goals. For a city occupying a tenth of Las Vegas's land area at 12 square miles with only around 700,000 residents, Macau generated revenues 6 times that of America's gambling capital. And it was all going swimmingly. But then in 2020, a global pandemic hit. The pandemic was a shock to Macau's economy, revealing a vulnerability that had been ignored for a long time. For years, Macau's prosperity had depended almost entirely on the gaming industry, a single source of revenue that accounted for over 50% of its GDP and around 80% of its tourism revenue. When borders closed and travel stopped, Macau's casinos went silent, and the city's reliance on gambling became painfully clear. Suddenly, the Las Vegas of Asia found itself grappling with a simple question. Could Macau survive if gambling faltered? The government, along with Beijing, saw this crisis as a call to action. For years, the central government had urged Macau to diversify, wary of its reliance on gambling and concerned about capital flight from the mainland. As Macau's recovery dragged, officials pushed even harder. Beijing restricted the number of visits mainland residents could make to Macau and cracked down on high-rolling gamblers suspected of corruption. These high rollers, often wealthy Chinese businessmen and politicians, account for 43% of the industry's earnings. The result? Gross gaming revenue fell from a peak of $45 billion in 2013 to just $22 billion last year, a drop that exposed the urgent need for change. To renew their licenses, Macau's 6 casino operators, Wynn, Sands, SJM, MGM, Malco, and Galaxy, were given a mandate: invest heavily in non-gaming projects or risk losing their place in the market. These casinos pledged a combined $13.6 billion to diversify, funding everything from convention centers to water parks, aiming to turn Macau into a more rounded destination, less dependent on gaming. Take Galaxy Entertainment Group's 61,000 square meter high-tech amusement park that's in the works. The Galaxy Group already has expanded its massive Galaxy Resort to include a water park and a concert arena. There's also the Chimelong spaceship, set to become the world's largest indoor theme park. But while the projects sound promising, the shift is easier said than done. As of 2022, gaming still represented nearly 95% of Macau's total revenue from tourism, a statistic that highlights the challenge ahead. The government's experiment is as ambitious as it is uncertain. Macau's casinos have been assigned old districts to redevelop, each with historical or cultural value. Local officials hope these investments will help revitalize the city, preserving its architecture and promoting Macau's unique blend of Portuguese and Chinese heritage. The transformation aims to move Macau closer to the Vegas model, where non-gaming revenue makes up around 70% of casino earnings. But Macau's path to diversification remains uncertain, and many observers question whether these shifts can really change the city's identity. For casino operators, compliance with the government's diversification push could mean sacrificing profitability. Non-gaming attractions, from zip lines to retail shops, may draw tourists but yield far less profit than gaming. And there's still resistance among operators who see gambling as a proven moneymaker. This hesitation has led to what some critics describe as half-hearted attempts to diversify. Retail spaces filled with designer brands and concert lineups dominated by dated acts. And there's still the issue of organized crime. Macau authorities have certainly worked to loosen their grip on the gambling industry in recent years, jailing over 10,000 people suspected of laundering money through the peninsula's casinos and capping the amount of money that can be exchanged in the semi-autonomous region to $50,000. This restriction is intended to curb capital flight and control the amount of money that can legally be brought from mainland China into Macau. Chinese visitors are limited in the amount of yuan they can exchange into other currencies, including the Hong Kong dollar, which is widely used in Macau. There's also a yearly limit on withdrawals from ATMs and a cap on single transactions. The junkets of Stanley Ho's era have been pushed out, but there are still questions about how much power they still wield. Macau's place as Asia's top gambling hub faces a real threat from new competitors who are investing big in casino entertainment as well. In Singapore, Marina Bay Sands and Resorts World Sentosa, 2 integrated resorts already recognized worldwide, are raising the stakes. Marina Bay Sands alone is set for an $8 billion expansion, complete with a 570-suite hotel tower, a 15,000-seat arena, and even more space for gaming. These additions aim to cement Singapore's position as a luxury gaming destination and to draw millions of tourists from around the globe. The numbers reflect its pull. In 2023, Singapore's gambling revenue hit $3.7 billion, positioning it as a serious contender on Macau's turf. The Philippines is no slouch either, with Manila's entertainment city transforming the country into a gaming powerhouse. The Philippines' gaming revenue reached roughly $5 billion in 2023, and with $6 billion more expected in investments over the next 5 years, the momentum is clear. New projects are emerging in places like Cebu and Clark, which aim to attract tourists not only from Asia, but also from Europe and North America. As the experiment unfolds, Macau's future hangs in a delicate balance. The city's transformation isn't just about adding attractions, it's about redefining Macau itself, and the stakes are high. With new casinos rising across Asia and Beijing's ever-present scrutiny, Macau's survival as Asia's gaming capital may depend on its ability to adapt. For now, Macau's pivot toward diversification is a bet on its future. But whether this gamble will pay off remains a question that only time will answer. Thank you for watching.